It was a time before interstates and airline hubs, when Cherry Cokes came from drugstore fountains and Kirby's brought trays of food to car windows. It was a time when our world was a little smaller and connected to Main Street.
It was a pretty colorful town. It was a busy town.
Downtown crowded all the time, you know, just throngs of people. That's where everybody went, downtown.
But everything was in the down. There was no out lane. When you got out as far as McClure Street, that was just about the end of everything.
Downtown was filled with the bustle of a large city. Everything was there. The nightclubs, restaurants, stores, business. And who could forget those wonderful, large, ornate movie theaters like the Madison, Rialto, and Palace? At the Palace, the walls were lined with the names of composers, and above was a beautiful dome lit by blue lights. It all added to the atmosphere and adventure of going downtown to see a show.
Oh yes, it was quite an experience too. It was not just coming in to see a motion picture, it was an experience. It was an evening of entertainment. The decor of the theater added so much to the experience of coming to see a motion picture.
Ornate, beautiful, well-lit, garlands all over.
The general decor was silver and blue. The ceiling was gorgeous, even nicer than the Madison, I think. And it was one of the regular old-time, you know, early 19th century movie houses like the Roxy in New York and the big ones in Chicago. They didn't spare the horses in those days.
Well, it was a very large, spacious theater, one of the what you would call the movie palace type large theaters, as was the Madison Theater. There were two competitors, and both very beautiful buildings. In the auditorium of the palace was a huge crystal chandelier. It was in there for years. They finally removed it because they were concerned about it being a hazard. It hung by a cable, and they were afraid that it might fall and seriously injure people, and so they removed it from the auditorium. But it was a beautiful, huge chandelier.
And there were ushers who went up and down the aisles all during the shows, and they had flashlights. If you misbehaved, you had a flashlight shined in your face.
We used to sneak into the shows, and even though it was only a nickel, sometimes later on a dime, what we would do is pool our money. A couple of guys would put their pennies together, and one guy would go in and buy a ticket for a dime, and then he'd come around to the side doors, and when the ushers weren't looking, 3 or 4 of us would sneak in. We got caught a couple of times, and one time they were really going to teach us a lesson. They took us down to the city hall, down to the police station, and kept us locked up for about 3 hours to teach us a lesson.
Friday night was when all the freshmen during, do I dare say Hell Week? Well, during Hell Week, the freshmen were forced to sit in the first 2 rows, the freshman girls, the first 2 rows, if they were pledged, of the palace. And they had to eat raw eggs and swallow oysters and do various things to get thrown out of the theater.
In 1920, as vaudeville began losing ground to Hollywood, both the Palace and Madison theaters were under construction, and a race developed to see who would finish first. The Madison won by sacrificing its backstage area,
so that it could not be used for flying scenery as the Palace Theater could be. And so the Palace then became the stage and motion picture theater, where the Madison Theater was strictly a Class A motion picture theater. Back in 1936, July, the Madison Theater had a world premiere. The movie was called Earthworm Tractors, and it starred Joey Brown, one of the top comics of Hollywood of the day. And it had a big parade. I know of the parade because I was 11 years old at the time, and I was running alongside of Joey Brown's automobile. It was the hottest day on record in Peoria, which holds today.
Premieres aside, in the days before television, the theaters always seemed packed. Besides being a major source of entertainment, they were also a haven from the summer's heat.
One thing that we remember particularly about the Madison were the big banners that went around the marquee. Ice cool.
Cooled with iced air.
Cooled with iced air. And it had, looked like icicles.
But of course, the Madison held about 1,700 people, and it would be full often. It had 1,700 people there watching a movie. That's a big crowd.
We would have packed houses. We'd open with a new picture every Thursday, and we would fill the theater 2 shows every night, Thursday and Friday nights, all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and people waiting in line at all the aisles, and pack the outer lobby with people waiting for the next movie. In those days, the usher staff was a major part of the experience of going to the theater. There were ushers that were assigned to each aisle individually, and the rookies were started on aisles which were the toughest to man. You started on aisle 2, which was the most popular aisle in the theater. In those days, the service was part of the adventure, I guess you'd say, of going to the theater and enjoying yourself for the evening.
In 1979, the Rialto was raised to make room for the new Civic Center. Soon the Palace would follow. It was the end of an era.
And I think that the audience felt catered to, as opposed to the way it is today. You just buy a ticket and you walk in and you find your own seat and whatever.
Oh, the architecture and the decoration and all the bric-a-brac and the artwork and everything was just superb. You don't see anything like that anymore. We have these little shoe boxes, which is really too bad.
One of the great remembrances of me about downtown was the holiday season, when you would have trouble driving your car 1 block to the next. Each stoplight, there was just a solid mass of humanity crossing the street.
Traveling across country usually meant trains, and for many, Peoria's main departure point was Union Station, a large 3-story building located on what is now Commercial Avenue, just across the tracks from the current post office.
That station for many years was, it had sort of an ambience about it. It had sort of a, when you walked in, the high ceilings and the old wooden benches and things.
It was a beautiful station. It had a lot of beautiful interior wood decoration, marble, and that sort of thing. Very first-class depot.
It was very, very beautiful in its day. It had a mosaic tile floor, oak woodwork, 15 or 20 ticket booths, and large waiting room, encompassed barber shop, restaurants, all the things that travelers needed in those days when they be trained to come into a town like Peoria. But Union Station was built by the Peoria and Pekin Union, P&PU Railroad, and they rented space and trackage use out to all of the lines that came in, which would encompass the Burlington, the Emmons St. L, the Northwestern, the Chicago and Alton, both north and south, the TP&W, east and west, the Big Four, the Nickel Plate, Chicago, Springfield, St. Louis, later the Chicago, Illinois, Midland. All of these lines used Union Station.
But there was at one time, this was a crossroads for railroad, passenger rail, and approximately 138 trains a day came through Peoria.
I think one of the most unique things about Peoria Union Station was it was one of the very few ones in the whole country that had the streetcars, the electric trolley cars from Peoria coming right into the station under the same roof or train shed that the steam trains used, which meant, of course, that you could transfer over many of those years to a line such as, say, Maine Bradley, and go right into Union Depot, get off of the car in the dry, walk into the station, buy your ticket, walk back out at the proper time under the train shed and get on your coach or chair car or parlor car. It was a great service.
Passengers would leave and arrive under the protection of a large train shed. Built in 1883 at the cost of $25,000, it was later remodeled to span an area of 102 by 480 feet.
There's a story about that shed too. A freight train came through there one day with a crane on one of the flatbed cars, and it swung out as it went under the shed and hit each piling as it went, and the entire shed collapsed over the top of it.
That was the end of the great roof. It was never rebuilt. Union Station continued serving passenger trains until 1955. Later, as a warehouse, it was destroyed by fire in 1961. Getting around Peoria meant taking those large, shaky orange trolleys that seemed to run everywhere on the half hour. Not only was it public transportation, it was fun.
I remember going down Knoxville Hill in those big old double truck streetcars that just rock and shake. It was just kind of exciting. They never fell off the tracks. The wind would be howling through and screaming and howling down the hill, the wheels kind of, clacking along. It was quite exciting.
And you always hung out the windows in the summertime because the breeze was so nice. And it didn't smell. There wasn't any fumes.
Fare was a dime in those days. And you had streetcar tokens too. You could buy 3 tokens for a quarter. You could save a nickel.
And probably one of the most interesting things that occurred for pricing the streetcars was the old weekly pass. You could buy a pass for $1. And of course that did not have your identification on the card, and it could be used as the family needed it, or you could loan it to a friend or whatever.
Sometimes boys would get clever, and one would get on with his pass downtown, stick it out the window, and his buddy would use the same pass and get on. I think motormen knew this was happening, but they didn't care that much. And you could only do it at a corner where many people were getting off and on the cars, of course. The Prospect line, the Peoria Heights line, traveled on the west side of Prospect all the way out to the Rock Island Tracks, which many of you remember cut in just south of Pabst Blue Ribbon. And there they had a viaduct that went over the tracks. It was originally occasioned because of the difficulty of getting a crossing put in with the Rock Island Railroad, who objected to crossings of other lines crossing their tracks. When the line got up to Cyberling, where the stop sign is today, one line went straight ahead and around the curve on Prospect, which at one time was the location of a famous watering spot called Gray's Tavern. The other line went east on Cyberling and cut through the weeds to the country club, where today the golf course is, and that was the end of the country club line. That line also served to bring the hired help to the many well-to-do people who lived on Grandview Drive.
About 12, 1 o'clock was the last of the streetcars. Then they had what they called the early owl car. That was the car that came out real early to pick up streetcar motormen that had to go to work. It would travel certain routes, and as it did, it would also pick up people that had to go to work early, that started out 4 o'clock in the morning. About 5:30 was the first run started. And of course, everybody at Caterpillar and all the factories, they all rode the transit system. We drove the streetcars over there and took them over and brought them back, and we went across the interurban tracks and the interurban bridge.
I myself have seen as many as 12, 15 streetcars lined up on Washington Street in front of their plant and offices over there. And many of those cars were designated for a particular place in Peoria. So, for example, if you lived on the Elizabeth or Sheridan Road line, you would simply find the car marked Elizabeth Street and get on it. You never had to transfer because it simply switched on to Main Street and out Main Street to Sheridan Road or Elizabeth Street, as it was, and take you home.
Oh, that was quite a thing to take the old streetcars across the interurban bridge. See, in these streetcars, when you was a motorman, you were standing right up in front. You had the windows, you're looking right down, and you're looking right down the river underneath you, you know, and the old streetcars are wobbling because it really don't fit the interurban tracks quite right, you know. It's about ready to fall off of the dumb things because they weren't really made to run on the interurban tracks. There was a little difference in the wheel gauge there, you know. And it was pretty, you had to crawl across the thing, you know, and everybody was holding their breath. It was a shaking and a rattling, you know. Then you got on the other side, you breathed a little easier then, you know.
They had large cars for some of the major lines, and they had smaller cars for some of the lines that did not require that much seating capacity.
The larger cars, the double truck or 8-wheel cars, with a standing load could carry up to 100 people at one time. And they were plenty powerful. They climbed the hills very well with that. It didn't seem to make much difference how many people they had on. They went about the same.
Now, the Bernie was about half that size. It was a smaller streetcar, a little one that they used the Bernies on runs like Main Street, up around Bradley. In that area, you go up Main Street and to Western, down Western to Bradley, back Bradley to Garfield, up Garfield to Wyndham, back in Wyndham to Sheridan, up Sheridan to Main, and then back down Main Street Hill, back downtown again.
The trolleys were also a source of amusement to some of the more daring youths, such as this fellow who hopped aboard for a free ride.
We always had the kids, they get in the back end of the car and they'd slip the window down real quiet. So you kind of raised up on the windows and let them down. They'd go down the channel, then they'd reach out and they'd get a hold of the trolley rope and hold it, and then they'd pull it up out of its winder and wind it around so that it would catch and it wouldn't have the spring action no more. And then when you hit a dip in the wire, boom, off would fly your trolley and everything goes dead. And there you sit in the middle of the street, see. Then you got to get out, run all the way down and back around in there, pull it up out of there, pull her and put her back up on the tracks, on her wire up above, and then let her back down in her spring wind again. But them kids done that all the time. They were constantly pulling that on you.
It was a very common thing, although of course parents admonished against it and schools talked about it, but kids simply hooked on the back of a streetcar with their sled. And I've seen as many as 10 or 12 sleds on the back of a streetcar, one kid hanging onto another, onto another.
Oh, they were cold. They had electric heaters along the sideboards, which half the time they didn't work, and they were colder than all Billy H, you know. And the big open cars, and they were all rattly because they were getting old, and the air come in everywhere. And everybody always froze to death on the dumb thing.
On October 3rd, 1946, at 12:45 a.m., the last streetcar run was completed. Buses would now take their place.
You know, there was a mystique and a romance to the streetcars that the buses never managed to capture again. I don't know what it was. It was just a lot of fun riding them.
It's on the corner where the Peoria Public Library is right now, and that was one of the places where we all used to gather around after school or on weekends or after movies and so forth, because Throckmorton's was famous for their molded milks.
Travel today is faster, and a lot of journeys begin at the Greater Peoria Airport, which got its start when several prominent citizens bought 190 acres.
We were one of the early pioneers because of that group of citizens who had the foresight to create and buy the land without any tax revenue from the city people. We had a head start, a leg up on getting airline traffic, passenger traffic in and out of Peoria.
The original runways were made of shale, and while there was no passenger service, they did allow the mail to be flown.
And finally, about in the middle 30s, when the airlines began to become more prevalent throughout the United States, this group of people found that they could no longer afford to upgrade the field with their corporation, so they deeded the corporation at no price, at no money, gave the corporation to the city of Peoria. City of Peoria didn't want it, so they in turn gave it to the Park District. And the Park District, for a number of years, operated the airport. You know, when we got back from World War II, because that period is tremendously important in my judgment, the airport really hadn't progressed very far, because the Park District, as great as it was in handling park land, really was out of its element insofar as the airport was concerned. And it really didn't appreciate having to maintain and operate an airport. So the field stood rather still insofar as progress was concerned because of lack of funding from a period of about 1937 to 1945.
Another problem had arisen. The airport sat upon a coal mine, and part of the land had sunk, creating huge cracks in the runways.
And we lost half of the Air National Guard ramp, and we lost our biggest runway, our longest runway, with cracks right down the middle of it.
If nothing was done, the Air National Guard would leave. So out of necessity, the Airport Authority was created.
And that caused the buyout of the mine underneath the airport and allowed us to pump cement down there and raise the Air National Guard ramp, and also to raise the runway that had subsided. And of course, we are aware of that mine to this date, and anytime we put up a new building or a structure of any kind with any weight, we make sure that we drill holes to see that the surface can support that building.
And one of those structures was the new terminal building, replacing what had become a very crowded shack.
It was across on the east side of the field, and it was very small. It accommodated maybe no more than 30 or 40 people in the lobby. Yeah, because you not only had the passengers in there, you also had the administration for the airport, and you had the Weather Bureau in there, the back end of it, so it was crowded. But when the airlines went to twin-engine equipment, then our runways, which were made of shale and were only 1,900 feet long, were considered inadequate, so there were no commercial airplanes coming in here for passenger service during that period from 1940 to 1945.
But with the improvements, the airlines did return in 1945.
We had three. We had American, TWA, and an outfit called Chicago and Southern. They announced the fares, and the fare for Peoria to Chicago, one way, was $7.91. To St. Louis, it was $9.56, and you could go to New Orleans one way for $49.50, and all the way to Los Angeles for $115, one way. I flew during those times, back in the late 30s and early 40s. And today's service, to me, is so much better than it was because of the equipment. You have so many more nice amenities on board the airplanes today than you had back there. If you had to go to the bathroom in those airplanes, you froze, because the bathrooms were not heated, and it was cold as the dickens on a long flight.
In the late 40s, the green colors of Ozark Airlines began landing at Peoria. They flew DC-3s, the old tail draggers.
Everybody remembers walking uphill, you know, because it's a tail dragger, you always walked uphill to get, you know, it's kind of, if you were too frail and too fragile, somebody almost had to be behind pushing you. But it was always a neat plane. And when you got on the airplane, when you took off, you really knew you were going to take off, because this thing was like flying on a bumblebee. You'd get on the runway and it would rev up and it would just be shaking all over, and pretty soon it would just shake a little more, and then pretty soon you'd gather up speed and off you'd go.
Later, the airline offered direct jet service to the East Coast.
Sure, you could, that route from Peoria to Champaign to Dulles in Washington, D.C., and then on to New York several times a day was a magnificent service, and it was always full. Then they added the New York, Detroit, Peoria run, and that was a good traffic builder for Ozark. So we had good service out of Peoria.
There was an alfresco beach, and then further up there was a Kelly's Beach. It was quite a popular swimming area. Sandy bottom.
And everybody swam in the river then, and there'd be some rafts we'd swim out to and dive off of those. And they had some kind of a water-type slide. You'd get on these boards and fly into the water.
While theaters were one source of major entertainment, the other was radio. And for many years, there was only one local radio station in Peoria, WMBD, which was located downtown.
Actually, WMBD first started on Glen Avenue right off of Grandview Drive, and thereby the call letters WMBD, which stood for the world's most beautiful drive, going back to the famous quote of Teddy Roosevelt. From the Grandview Drive area, WMBD moved downtown and was located in the old Mayor Hotel, and eventually moved to the Alliance Life building, which became the First National Bank building, which in turn became the Commerce Bank building. In the early 50s, I believe it was, WMBD moved to what was the Majestic Theater.
Majestic Theater hadn't been used for, well, since 1937, I think, when the last performance was done in it. Been closed up and covered with dry, gray dirt all over it. But we built a radio station in and made provisions to build a TV station in, which we did later on in the end of the 50s.
WMBD had its own orchestra for many years, with folks like Ozzy Osbourne at the keyboard, and the Rashid sisters, who delighted many folks with their wonderful singing.
Al, Flo, and Billy were the trio. Well, we did maybe half hour, 15 minutes rehearsing for our program. Orchestra would run through one number to make sure they thought they could get by, you know. The gals would rehearse maybe one chorus, a song they were going to do. We do these in what network program would be on Pat Straight Through, or a local news would, from, I believe it was 7:30 to 8, I believe it was, network news and local news were mixed, and they were done at another studio. And we had 3 studios, radio studios in there at the time. I would be in there at 5 o'clock every morning, do a half hour on the air local stuff with Phil Gibson, local news, and Farmer Bill with his morning farm news, a few little recordings, you know. And Emo was great for wake-up music. He loved polka music. His name was Emo, by the way, Farmer Bill. I hadn't been to work here very long. Supervisor came to me and said, "You're an old farm person." Yeah, he said, "You're accustomed to waiting barnyards." Now, that's not what he said, but we say he's accustomed to waiting barnyards. Yeah. Well, he said, from now on, you're going to pack the recording machine and go with Farmer Bill. Go maybe to Pontiac, as I say, to do, we'd be there a day and a night. Next day on the way home, we'd stop Roanoke or Metamora, have lunch. We never paid. No, this one's on the house, just for you, farmer. That's how well he had known.
Besides Farmer Bill, WMBD had other personalities who endeared themselves to Peorians. There was Jack Brickhouse, who hosted the Man in the Street interviews and did the first live broadcast of Bradley basketball. And then there was Juvenile Theater with its host, Wayne West.
He was a taskmaster. Those kids, boy, he would yell at them, and if they didn't perform to his expectation, they weren't on Juvenile Theater that day. He was a real taskmaster, but a real jovial person. He had a great sense of humor, as I said, had a lot of jokes. Wayne was just a superb person to know. They were dancers. You wonder about dance and radio, mostly tap dancing. There were musicians, pianists, organ. The organ, kids that played the organ didn't get to play. We went to a remote somewhere where they didn't have an organ at, you know. They didn't make it, but pianos were almost everywhere. There was youngsters that played guitars. He had one time a trio that played trumpets one season, 1 or 2 seasons I remember.
And I used to sing in there. I used to sing in there with the juvenile program, as well as in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade of grade school, Sacred Heart, where I went to grade school. I was in the spelling bees back in those days, and that's where we had them. We had to stand up for 2.5 or 3 or 3.5 hours in the spelling bees, and as you broadcast live over the radio.
Milton Budd, one of my favorites. I hated Milton and loved him. One of the most humorous persons there were, one of the most vulgar, had rotten jokes, and he had more tricks. One of Milton's favorite tricks, and he caught me with it when I came there young. You worked control rooms then, you were working with 78 RPM recordings, as well as live musicians. So you had to run a turntable until it ran up to speed. They weren't, this is the day of modern technology, those days weren't. You would start the thing, hold the recording until announcer gave you a cue, or you read a script to cue to play it. And Milton would be talking, and suddenly there was no sound. You'd look at him, and he was still talking. Nothing come out. You'd turn your recording loose and grab a patch cord to go to a patch panel to bypass that amplifier to another one. And by the time you hit the patch panel, Milton was talking again. All that time, he hadn't been saying a word. Johnny Rayburn was one of the worst at it. He went through the door, and you were sitting there waiting for him to turn the light on. He was sports. Sports people are notoriously behind, and their desks are cluttered. But Rayburn was rarely ever on time. He went through that door, and I looked to see if the light was on. See, Dolly light. He was talking before he sat down in the chair.
WMBD broadcast live from so many events, from downtown locations, from the Peoria Fair, from events at the old Peoria Armory, And WMBD was key in so many facets of entertainment for Peorians in those years.
And matter of fact is when I graduated in 1940, I took the streetcar downtown and got there just in time for the broadcast. They always had a broadcast on WMBD on Thursday nights. That was a big night for them on Thursday. Always amazed me how they filled that place up on a Thursday night. You think it'd be a Saturday, but Thursday night was just loaded all the time.
Yes, Thursday nights were big. WMBD broadcast for many years from the Inglaterra with live performances, and of course that's how some of the folks that Peorians remember so well, people like Milton Budd and Bob Carlton, earned their first recognition as Master of Ceremonies at performances like those.
Caught my first big band broadcast from Peoria, a musician named Griff Williams, an orchestra from the Inglaterra Ballroom. Then I had one of the Dorsey brothers there later, and that one made the CBS network.
Great bands at the Inglaterra Ballroom. All of the major bands in the country used to come and play there, and that was our entertainment. Loved to dance.
One of the more popular orchestras to play in Central Illinois was the Freddie Stevens Band, whose members recall the Ing fondly.
And then we were playing there off and on, probably, did we play maybe once a week there?
Oh yeah, I did.
Yeah, once a week. We were there, if not sometimes twice a week for parties and things that were going on.
It was a large oblong place, and it was a great place for brass players because you didn't have to hold back. But all around the sides were just benches. There were no tables in the place, except for in the little snack room they had in the balcony up there. And then they had a stage, was a good sized stage. You could get almost any size dance band on there. And it was elevated, and it also, well, it just gave you a great feeling up there with lots of room to play, and you weren't crowded. And it was a nice acoustics where you kind of get a slight echo, and it was just, it's a great place to play.
I've seen it packed with 2,000 people trying to dance, you know, when you had a big name band of the 40s in there, you know.
But they had no alcohol in the place either. And that's another thing that really, there were no drinks served there other than soft drinks. And it always amazed me that they were able to sustain without that, but they filled the place up every Thursday night. Thursday night was the biggest night of the year.
That was one of your major, probably the major ballroom downtown. Another one was the National Roof Garden, which was actually on the roof of the National Building, which later was called the Packard Building. There was a Packard dealership on the street floor. Down below that was the National Garage. It was a paid garage for parking automobiles.
But you would walk up 3 flights of stairs to the roof, and you would dance under the stars. And God, what great memories those were.
You were on the roof with no roof overhead, completely open. There were some covered spaces at either end, so you could duck under cover if there should be a sudden shower or something, but there was no cover over the main body of the dance floor.
And as I recall, the railing around it was about 3.5, 4 feet.
I don't remember.
But it always seemed like, to me, as though it were marble. I don't think it was, but I felt as though it were. And it was heavenly because there were the stars overhead and sometimes the moon, and you could see the river, and oh, it was so romantic and cool. No air conditioning, of course, except natural air conditioning, and it was always cool up on the roof.
People came to dance, not sit around and drink or anything. They either came to dance or they came to stand out on the floor and listen to the band.
Dearie, please don't be angry, 'cause I was only 10.
One of the major bands that come out of Peoria was Tiny Hill, a very popular orchestra. Tiny Hill was a large man, over 300 pounds, about 6'1", and he had a very interesting dance band, very danceable music. And he headquartered out of the Inglaterra for quite some time. But then he went regional and then for a time national as a big band.
He was the, what do you want to call it, the novelty band of the time. Light music, nothing small or serious. Tiny Hills was rollicking music.
Angry, please don't be angry, 'cause I was only teasing you.
An interesting side note, one of the original members of Tiny's band was Ozzy Osbourne, who, when tired of traveling, took a job at WMBD Radio and eventually became its musical director.
Now just because I took a look at somebody else.
While Tiny Hill's band was attracting audiences around central Illinois, so was the Freddie Stevens Orchestra.
Freddie Stevens Orchestra, music as you like it. I think by head and shoulders it was the finest band and the most popular and the most prominent.
And the original leader was Fred Stevenson. And they had a contest at the Hub to name the band. They didn't really have a name for it. And a contest winner submitted the name Freddie Stevens as opposed to Fred Stevenson's name. And that became the band. And during the years, down through the years after that, various members of the band would lead it. And everybody assumed that was Freddie Stevens, but Freddie Stevens was not always the same person.
One of the most unique things, I think, about the Stevens band, in addition to having pretty good men, we also had 4 arrangers on the band at the time, so it made it kind of unique that way. So nobody was copying our stuff. We had our very own.
Yeah, and that's hard work, boy. When we were sitting there reading and playing and doing all the things you had to do, and we had a lot of novelty tunes on the Stevens band. Oh boy, we had a bunch of stuff to do, and it pretty well tapped your strength in 4 hours. We did a thing with bottles called the bottle tune, and everybody in the band had a bottle filled with different water, and it would make a different tone. And as we played the tune, there were fellows popping up and down, tapping on this with a mallet and playing the bottles. And that was one of the things we did.
It was unusual in those days not to have a job on Saturday night. If you couldn't find one of the real good jobs, you always took one in one of the taverns, and you could always find work somewhere. Union in those days had different rates for different ballrooms. The ballroom job paid more than the tavern job, so therefore you usually try to hold out and see if you get your ballroom job before you start searching for a job on Saturday night on one of the taverns.
And then if you didn't get that and you took a tavern job, you looked around for one that went from about 9 till 3 in the morning. And you pile up the hours and try to equalize the pay.
Many of them went to 4 o'clock.
Yeah, they sure did. We had a 4 o'clock law then, and many of them played till 4 o'clock.
I remember one time we had powder blue suits. Yeah. And I went to the restroom and somebody turned the hair blower upside down and filled it full of white powder, white soap powder. And I came back and I never, it had to take a dry cleaning to get that out of there.
Although they never played atop the Packard building, there were other outdoor arenas in the area.
Oh, the Palisades Ballroom. We opened that up with this big band. And it was located out on the road to Dunlap, back in the woods. A magnificent, big, open roof ballroom. It had, I tried to recall yesterday, it had a balcony that ran around, and they had some kind of a canopy over that, and then tables were, and there were tables up there all around, and then they had tables down below the balcony all around, and a beautiful dance floor. An excellent place to play, a fine stage, good acoustics, outdoor acoustics, the best you could get.
It got the music out on the dance floor. I kind of like that. I mean, if you don't mind the bugs, it was pretty nice. The bugs give you a problem every now and then, and we played several of those right off the music. The Stevens Band was, without a doubt, the most popular band around for sustained for a good number of years.
We hope you've had a very fine time tonight. I know that we have. We hope you'll have us back again very soon. This is Russ Blackford saying goodnight for Pat Tate and all the boys in the band. Wishing you the best of the new year. Everything to come. Good night.
They had a beautiful lobby. Jefferson Hotel had a beautiful lobby. Very, very high balcony with, again, mezzanine all around the upper level of it. They had gorgeous light fixtures, and then they had a nice restaurant in the back of the first floor. It was a fine hotel. And incidentally, one of the memories there is that on April the 23rd, 1941, on Trudy's birthday, her 18th birthday, I might add, that's where we had our engagement party. And the two families, her family and our family, came together, and I gave her her ring on that date in a little mezzanine or something at the old Jefferson Hotel.
At one time, Bradley University fielded its own football team. Originally, the games were played on campus, where Olin Hall now stands, but by the mid-1950s, both the practice facility and games had been moved off campus.
Most of our home games were played at the Peoria Stadium out on War Memorial Drive, a stadium that would seat, probably between 10 and 11,000 people, although we didn't have that many fans, but sometimes we'd have up to 5,000 or 6,000 in the late 50s and early 60s.
You know, it was interesting. We would play at home and play in front of a very small crowd. We'd go on the road and play Central Michigan or Akron or Southern Illinois as an example, Northern Illinois, and play in front of quite a few people, anywhere from 6 to as much as 12,000, 14,000 people.
On autumn afternoons, despite the attendance, Bradley would take the field in their red jerseys against some pretty impressive teams.
I patterned our uniforms after the San Francisco 49ers with the cardinal red and 3 white stripes, white numerals, white helmets, and white pants. And I thought they looked sharp. We had a lot of compliments through the years on the uniform of our players. I told them if they're going to be real football players, they might as well look like real football players. And they did.
We had pretty good equipment. There was a lot of equipment passed along. I can remember getting some equipment with some people's names on it that had to play 15 years before I was there.
Homecoming was probably one of the highlights of the season. You know, in October, the leaves are beginning to fall and turn, and the air was a little bit nippy. We'd have big pep rallies down at Bradley Park with the fires. We'd have house decks that the houses just did a super job. The fraternities and sororities were just great. And we'd have our floats, our parades downtown, the homecoming queen. It's just It was just like you would read back in the old days. That's the way the homecomings were. It was a just great time of the year. The school was associated with the Missouri Valley and everything but football. And the Valley was too big for us to play football in. Consequently, we had to play an independent schedule. And we got stuck at the end with some pretty good-sized schools and teams that we had no business playing.
Another story is we played Pensacola Naval Base with Roger Staubach as the quarterback, who spent many years with the Dallas Cowboys. And as I remember it, they had something like 17 All-Americans on their team. That was during the Vietnam War. You know, we were always known for throwing the ball, and Billy Stone, of course, was the football coach and had a throwing offensive attack. And one of the things I remember, we played Akron out in Akron, Ohio, and I might be off a little bit, but we threw the football 69 or 74 times. I mean, every play was almost in the air.
I think at that time, we were the only school in the country that really threw the ball a great deal. Coaches at that time thought the only way to move the ball is on the ground. Well, we had a little more imagination than that. In fact, it was our passing offense that upset a lot of these football teams.
You know, Coach Stone had a brilliant offensive mind and had one of the best passing attacks in the country. There were several quarterbacks that played at Bradley. Bobby Kress is one of them that comes to my mind that, if I'm correct, and I think I am, led the nation in passing. So Bradley was noted as an offensive powerhouse that threw the football, threw it very well, with a very sophisticated passing attack.
We had quarterbacks that led the nation in total offense and passing offense. We had one quarterback as a sophomore make the little All-American team. Every year, our quarterbacks were either #1 or in the top 5 in passing offense. Well, I had several coaches from our schools that we played made comments that there's no sense of them trying to scout us any longer, because between the formations and the pass patterns that we use, they just can't keep up with us. We were just far ahead of other schools. That's all there was to it. We had one school that came in here, Parsons College, which was #1 in the country, won 10 games in a row, and they were going to come in and really wallop us. Well, they scouted us several ball games in a row, and I figured, well, we're going to have to change our offense quite a bit. So we did change it, and we had them down about 40-0 at halftime.
We were playing Hillsdale College up in Hillsdale, and the temperature was probably 35, 38 degrees. And the turf was all torn up in big pieces, and it was freezing, and you were totally soaked, and the uniform was frozen to your body. And I also remember Al Good, who was an offensive tackle from the East Coast. Stone was yelling for him, and you were so wet and cold. Good was laying on the bench with all the warm-up jackets piled on top of him, and we couldn't find him until we started taking off the warm-up jackets, and there he was on the bench, warm.
But I think one game that really sticks out in my mind as well as that one, and that was our last year that we played football at Bradley. In our last home game, we upset the University of Wisconsin of Milwaukee. It was just a big win. It was Dad's Day. We had a great crowd for a team that hadn't even won a ball game yet. We had several fathers come over after the game and tell us that they've been to Ohio State games and they've been to this game and that game, but they had never witnessed a super win by the kids themselves as they did today.
I remember we were playing Wayne State up in Detroit, Michigan, and I believe they kicked off to us. And Larry Sellinger, who played at Springfield Griffin High School, was our quarterback. And I think the first play of the game, he threw an interception. They kicked to us again, and I think Sellinger threw another interception. and Wayne State did come in and score again. We were down 14-0. There was about 2 minutes gone in the first quarter.
Yeah, after those interceptions, the next time he went out there, he was the punter also, and he kicked the ball straight up in the air. I don't think it went about 20 yards if it went that far. And Larry had his head down, and when he came off the field, I walked out there about 10 yards to meet him and kind of put my head down. I said to Larry under my breath, I said, "You got any other tricks up your sleeve, boy?" So it ended up he got a kick out of it, I got a kick out, and the players got a kick out of it. So we were competitive, but by the same token, it wasn't a case of life or death, whether we won or lost. It was a case of making an effort and enjoying yourself.
Oh yeah, that was really great. Kids loved it. It was quite a climb to the top. I don't remember how many stairs or how tall it was, but it was just kind of a steel skeleton, and it had a roof on top. It looked vaguely like a pagoda from on the top. That you'd walk up there, and then, of course, when you walked up, you'd have to stay for a while. You just didn't want to walk up and look around and go right back down again because you're gasping and panting and throwing paper airplanes down, and they'd go for miles, it seemed like.
And you walked all the way up the stairs, open stairs, you know, with just bare railings going on the sides. And when you got there, of course, the view was spectacular, all up and down the river and all over all the empty plots which were around and are now filled with houses. It was a glorious place to go and wander around.
Downtown was the shopping mecca. In a time before malls and suburban growth, and unless one was extremely fussy, everything could be found along a single stretch of Adams.
The shopping area was really from the corner of Main and Adams, down Adams Street. That was the first 2 or 3 blocks of South Adams Street was your main shopping district. And of course, there was also some shopping on Jefferson Street as well.
Now you're coming up. Right back here you started in the big store. It was Cohen Furniture Company. Then next door was another furniture store, and then here, this is Peoria Dry. Across the street's Montgomery and Ward. And then you've got Klein's, and you've got the First National Bank. That's the old original First National Bank in there. And you got J.C. Penney's stores right in there. And then you go on next to it, there's Bergner's Rig Store. Across the street is Block and Cools there. And then between Block and Cools and Clark's at the corner of Main and Adams were the dime stores. Kresge's, you had Kresge's and Woolworths, and across the street were Newberry's. That block, the first block was the dime store block on both sides. Those were dime, nothing but solid. And then, of course, was the Central National Bank building across from Clark's on the corner of Main and Adams there.
I remember the family would go together. Usually, you know, your mom would take you and the kids, and you'd go shopping and get dragged along to places you didn't want to go, but eventually you'd end up at Block and Cools, which was sort of the frosting on the cake. That was a treat, you know, if you could stand to go into some fabric shop or something, or then you got to go to Block and Cools and maybe have a sundae or something at the restaurant.
Block and Cools, the big white store, was the main department store of Peoria. It seemed to have everything and was often referred to as Downstate's Marshall Fields.
The floor walkers met us at the door, welcomed us. Most of the time they knew who we were and asked what we wanted, where we wanted to go, took us there, or showed us to someone who could show us.
I've never seen another store like that, except maybe in Europe. Some of the fancy department stores are like Block and Cools. The ladies who would wait on you would ask you very courteously, "May I help you?" And they all wore really nice clothes, black jersey dresses, and you know, they all looked great, and they were very courteous and mannerly and so forth. The place had just a lot of class.
Mrs. Goldberger was in charge of the glove department, and I had to be, I think I was a senior in high school before I was allowed to work in her department because she was very particular. And she taught us a great deal of etiquette about the wearing of gloves and the handling of gloves and the selling of them and the different kinds of gloves. And when anyone wanted gloves, they were seated on a stool in front of a counter, and then the salesperson would ask the woman, it was always a woman, these were women's gloves, woman to put her elbow in a nice little rubber donut that was there on the counter, and to straighten out her hand, and then we salespersons would always measure around this part of the hand, find the right size of gloves, and then carefully work them from the little finger on over, leaving the thumb out. The thumb was always the last to go in, then you smooth the glove down.
Another interesting thing about blocks, I remember in the basement, my aunt, Leona Lammers, ran the millinery department. That was when everybody wore hats. The ladies all wore hats. And she was very outspoken and very imperious. And no matter who came into town to buy a hat, and they'd go to her. And people would somehow walk around, maybe try on a hat and come up to her and say, "What do you think of this hat?" She'd say, "That hat looks terrible. Take that hat off immediately," you know. And then she'd get them the proper hat to wear. And you could hear her for a long way around the basement hollering, not hollering, but very loud, telling people, "No, no, you don't want that." You know, and then she would get, and she had customers that came back. This was the way they wanted to be treated. You know, they wanted to be told, "This hat is for you. This hat is not for you." And she was really good at it.
Inside, elevators were staffed with operators who announced the departments on each floor. And at the top, shoppers could rejuvenate themselves at a first-class restaurant.
All linen tablecloths and bouquets of real flowers, changed every day.
Even a lot of businessmen ate lunch up on Block 7 floor restaurant. One whole wall, the southwest wall, was glass, even in those days. And you could see the river and look out all over East Peoria and part of the downtown. It was a classy place to eat.
And it was always right next to the giftware department and the pottery and china and things of that kind. So that as you wandered through, either before or after, you see you were exposed to the very best.
To celebrate certain national holidays, a large flag was hung over the front of Block and Cool's.
It was huge, and it was so heavy that when the weather forecast was for rain, they would remove it. They'd drop the flag so that it didn't get wet, because when it got wet, it was so heavy it could not be handled on the front of the building.
But it was during the Christmas season that the store really lit up. A season that began with the Santa Parade, which brought St. Nick to Block and Cool's front window.
They would, the parade would come through town and wind up in front of Block and Cool's, stop traffic. They'd have thousands of people down there. And I've seen pictures of Santa climbing a hook and ladder from the fire department going up to the second or third floor and through the window of the building. But he held forth in the window at the corner, the main front window. And all of the toys in that window would be animated also. It was really quite a wonderful marketing aspect for Christmas time. As a child, I couldn't wait for Christmas to go up to the 5th floor, which was Toy Town. And it was a magnificent Toy Town. They had all of the trains and all of the automatic toys operating, and all of the dolls for the girls were there, and the animated ones and so forth. It was really a wonderful fairyland of toys for children.
There used to be an organ grinder there, and he actually had a thing he'd grind like this. He had a big black mustache and a funny little hat, sort of looked like Harpo Marx in a way, and he had this monkey in a little red suit and a little pillbox type hat strapped under his chin. The monkey had a little tin cup, and he'd dance around to the music and then run around with his cup, and people would throw nickels and dimes in it. I think that was at Christmas time, I'm not sure, but the organ grinder and Block and Cool's were kind of synonymous.
Saturday night, the sidewalks of Peoria, winter and summer, would be packed with people, particularly in the summer. Sometimes you went down to see who else was there. Many times, my father would drive our car downtown Peoria on Adams or Main Street and park it in the afternoon when he could find a parking place. No limit on parking then. Take the streetcar home. We'd all take the streetcar downtown, sit in our automobile because it was holding a parking place for it, and spend a couple of hours just looking at people going by. And we weren't alone. Many did that too.
Before the burger chain swept across the country, 2 local drive-ins attracted the mobile crowd. Here, Hunt's on Farmington Road looks more like a used car lot than a restaurant. And at the top of the hill was Kramer's, which was later sold to Jim Jumer, who built his Castle Lodge next door.
Kramer's, I remember rather well. They had a great Dutch apple pie. Of course, they had a kind of a German motif even then, which evolved into Jumer's. Pretty much of a drive-in. You could go inside and eat, but I think a lot of people just ate in their cars. They'd bring out the tray and stick it on the window and you'd eat. And I guess when you're done, you turn your lights on and they'd come and take the stuff away.
And Hunt's Drive-In was their major competition, was on Farmington Road. But the interesting story about that location is that before it was Kramer's Drive-In, it was Hunt's. And Mr. Hunt apparently had a problem with the owner of the land there, and when his lease ran out, unbeknownst to the owner of the land, he went out there after midnight one night with a flatbed truck and jacked up this small drive-in kitchen area of the restaurant and transported it out to Farmington Road, and that's where it is today, and at Farmington Road. That's the same one that was on Western originally.
Mrs. Hunt used to run the kitchen, and the greatest tenderloins probably on earth. My heavens, those tenderloins must have been a foot in diameter. Certainly, they had curb service in those days, something you don't see too much of these days. And I can tell you that Mrs. Malou, Trudy, and I, many a night, sat in our cars out at Hunt's and had our tenderloin or sandwich and an ice cream or Coke or something.
All the kids hung out in these places, you know, the high school kids. They're just really great meeting places. And as I recall, pretty peaceable, not many problems as far as, you know, fights or anything.
Downtown, a popular restaurant for lunch or after shows was the Sugar Bowl. Located across from the Palace Theater, it was known for its homemade ice creams and sundaes.
It was a regular Greek-style soda fountain and restaurant with tile floors, marble-top tables, long and narrow, not too much of a street frontage, and went back, I think, at least 120 feet from the street, with a candy counter and chocolate counter on one side and tables for lunch, and you could also get supper there.
Sugar Bowl had like a reception area. You generally, on evenings, or certainly on Sunday afternoons or evenings throughout the week, you'd have to wait. There were no reservations. You just go in and you'd sit. And they had booths. They had about 6 lines of 6 different rows of booths, and 4 to a booth. And it was a place to be. It was kind of the social place to be because you met everybody in town there, and they had great food. They had great food and just wonderful service, and what a treat! What a treat it was.
If you were at an age where you were eating chocolate sundaes and things of that kind, that was the place to go.
Oh, yes. All different kinds of ice cream. And we used to meet for lunch when we were first courting. And our favorite lunch was their chili mac. And for dessert, we had Tin Roof sundaes.
While the Sugar Bowl was known for its ice cream, there was only one place in Peoria to go for donuts.
Donny Flake was a small restaurant in the 100 block of South Jefferson. Oh, about 2/3 of the way down the street from Main Street in the first block. It was one of the better donuts. Very, very light and fluffy donut. But they made them there fresh every day right there behind the window.
He made donuts popular long before Mr. Donut or Dunkin' Donuts ever were even thought of. Again, that was a nighttime spot too. It was a good daytime spot, but after theater, after a dance, if you didn't feel like going down to Bolangers for chili, you'd go by Downy Flake Restaurant and get a couple of donuts and a cup of coffee.
But we all of us don't think any donuts yet come up to the Downy Flake donuts.
They were excellent
They were
donuts.
super.
The Beehive was the one up the street from Downy Flake, on the same side of the street, but at the corner of Main and Jefferson. And that's where the Jansen building is now located. But that was quite a place for younger people, especially date nights, go to the theater and take their dates to that restaurant. And there was a interesting at the Beehive. There was a small, very small balcony above where a few tables were located for not more than maybe 2 people at a table, and it was quite an intimate little restaurant.
Again, it wasn't a very big place. It had a few, maybe 8 or 10 booths on the first floor, and then they had a little balcony where they had about 5 or 6 more tables. And when Mrs. Maloof, when Trudy first moved to Peoria from Pekin, she was working there back in those days for Larry and I forget his wife, Sternfield. One of the things I remember most about the Beehive was they used to have like cherry Cokes or lemon Cokes.
Ice cream, donuts, and for something a little more substantial after an evening on the town, there was Bolangers.
Bolangers chili was, to me, the finest chili that you could buy. And it was in a rather interesting location. It was down at the corner of First Street at Franklin Street. That Franklin Street no longer exists there. That's the Kampf Boulevard area now. It was an all-night chili parlor, during the day too, but all night also, because there were a couple of striptease places and nearby, and there was other theater areas further up the street. So a lot of people that were out for a Saturday night or any night of the week for that matter, late night, usually wound up at Bolangers Chili Parlor.
And afterwards, you would go down to Bolangers, and it might be midnight or 12:30, but you'd have a bowl of their chili. It was the greatest chili ever on earth. And for years, everyone tried to figure out what was in their recipe, and they would never give it to anyone. But it was just a great place. And
very rich, heavy, greasy, wonderful chili. And it would kind of bring you back to life again if you were in need of such a thing. That was really good.
At the bars surrounding Bolangers, like those elsewhere in town, all you had to say was, "Give me Gibbs," Peoria's most popular beer during the 30s and 40s.
There was 3 principal breweries, the Gibbs, the Lacey, and the Union. Of course, the Prohibition, all 3 of them had to shut down. And after Prohibition in 1933, Gibbs was the only one to resume operations. In 1933, they had 100,000 gallons yearly production.
Gibbs was okay. They really pushed it hard, but it was kind of a cheap beer, Amberlin, Gibbs Amberlin. I don't know what Amberlin meant.
And the Amberlin goes back to 1881 when the Gibbs Brewing Company was incorporated. And we do not have any documented history as far as Amberlin is concerned, but amber means a golden yellow, and it probably referred to the color of the beer, which of course the Gips people were very proud of, the quality and the color of their beer. This is what we call a cone top can, which took a regular bottle cap to seal it on the top, and the logo of course here says Gips Amberlin, and famous since 1881. And then of course on the bottom we have Gips Brewing Corporation, Peoria, Illinois. And on the side we have Gips's famous slogan, "Gimme Gips." It normally sold for about 5 cents less than the Anheuser-Busch or Miller's or Schlitz or those kind.
I was playing softball with Gips right before I went into the service. When I came home in '46, the highest priority I think I had was I couldn't wait until spring to start working out with the Gips softball team. And about 15 of us played together for 13 years as Gips. Well, why was that important? After every ball game, locally of course, we were allowed to go down to the brewery and spend an hour, hour and a half just drinking cold Gips beer right out of the vats. There's no taste like it in the world, I don't think, but oh my, and yet no one ever abused it. I don't ever recall anybody ever drinking more than they were supposed to drink.
The Gips Brewery Company went out of business in 1954. The trademark was bought by a Chicago brewery company and was brewed in Chicago for a short period of time. From 1954 through 1956, the Gips Distributing Company was organized, and they distributed Canopop soda. And this lasted for only 2 years, and they went into bankruptcy. The soda Canopop originated out of Los Angeles, California. The brewery was located at Water and Bridge Streets, which Bridge Street later became Franklin Street. And of course, when they put in the new bridge, the old brewery was completely demolished.
Gips Beer, the Palace Theater, and the Inglaterra. Although gone, they still live in memories across central Illinois, where they were part of our common history, the places we once shared and grew up with, downtown.
That was kind of fun, just being downtown. When the lights would change between Bergner's and Block and Cool's, there'd just be this crush of people coming together, really hard to get through. People were courteous, but they'd nearly knock one another over, getting across the street.
And everybody knew everybody else, for one thing. Was that different?
I wouldn't trade that time for anything, because you got to live through a time there when life was all downtown and all hustle and bustle.